My name is Malcolm Winters. I've lived on the same 3 acres of land in rural Washington state for 26 years. The place doesn't look like much from the road-weathered siding, a metal roof that hums when it rains, and a garden patch that's mostly moss these days. But to me, it's a breathing thing. The soil holds the memory of every winter flood, every trout that ever slipped upstream, every bird that ever built a nest in the alder trees behind the house. It's quiet out here, at least it was. The first sign of change came on a Tuesday morning in early spring. The air still had that damp post-frost weight to it, and I'd just come back from picking up feed for the neighbor's chickens I was looking after. That's when I noticed the new concrete posts being sunk along the eastern edge of my lot, not by the county, not by the utility board, but by some landscaping firm out of Spokane. Trucks idling along the roadside like they had a right to be. There are no permit markers, no predict notices, just a silent crew, driving in posts, stringing lines and laying the bones of something that didn't belong. I walked over. No one looked at me, not the foreman, not the guy with the level, not even the kid hauling buckets of gravel across the grass that separated my property from the clearing next door. That land used to be a wetland buffer, marshy, lowly, and largely untouched. The only thing that ever changed was the waterline. But now, something was different. I asked to speak to the supervisor. A man in an orange vest and mirrored sunglasses finally turned around. "You the property owner?" he asked. "Next door," I replied, pointing to my place. "And I don't think this fence belongs here." He pulled out a clipboard, glanced at a printed site plan. "According to this, it does." Let me see that he didn't hand it over. Just shrugged. "You'll have to talk to the owner. We're just following instructions." The new owner of the land next door had arrived about 6 months ago. James Arlo, a young guy, maybe mid-30s, made his money in mobile app licensing. I'd heard, bought the adjacent 5-acre lot after the county reclassified part of it from protected to residential. Buildable. Claimed he wanted a modern rustic getaway. Solar-paneled walls, cedar sauna, rooftop greenhouse, all steel and ambition. I hadn't spoken to him much. He once waved while pulling out of his gravel driveway in a black SUV that looked like it had never seen dirt. The land hadn't meant anything to him. It was a backdrop. The next day the fence was finished. Clean metal slats, matte black, 6 feet high and laser straight, running right through the alder grove that bordered the seasonal stream between our lots, and 6 feet, maybe 7, into my land. I confirmed it using my original boundary markers still intact from when I bought the place. A pin buried flush beneath the garden shed corner, another next to the downed maple near the waterline. I'd planted moss and rivergrass all along that edge. Now it was crushed, fenced over, blocked from light. I knocked on James's door later that evening. He answered wearing joggers and no shoes, holding an espresso in a double-walled glass. "Malcolm, right?" he said, smiling. "What's up?" "I need to talk about your fence." He glanced past me. "Yeah, nice, huh? Took forever to find a crew that could get it done before the soil softened too much." "It's on my property," I said plainly. His smile didn't change. "I had it surveyed by who?" "Private firm. They used drones, topography scan. Super accurate." I shook my head. "My boundary markers haven't moved since 1997. That fence cuts into my property and the riparian buffer zone." His brow furrowed, just slightly. "You mean the ditch? It's a stream. Seasonal." "Yes, but it feeds into the Skagit tributary, which makes it regulated habitat under Title 222. He blinked. I could see it then. That moment where he stopped seeing me as a neighbor and started seeing me as an obstacle. "You're welcome to send me whatever records you have," he said, "but I'm confident in mine." My lawyer signed off. "I've already submitted the fence dimensions to the HOA." "There is no HOA," I said. "Then we're in even better shape," he said, smiling again. "Let's not make this messy. It's just a few feet of land. Malcolm, I'm sure you've still got plenty." The conversation ended there. I walked home as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across what used to be mine. That night I pulled out every file I had: property line certificates, wetland delineation surveys, aerial photos from the Department of Ecology database, even an old topo map from a university study in the late 80s. The buffer zone hadn't changed. The stream hadn't shifted. The law was still the law, but it wasn't just about legality. It was about arrogance. The idea that money, paperwork, and timing could outweigh truth. That someone could redraw the land with a crew of strangers and expect the world to applaud. I didn't plan to argue. I planned to verify. And once I had what I needed, I would file the kind of complaint that didn't go away. Not with lawyers, but with scientists, on with the state. It took me 3 days to assemble the full paper trail. Not because I was unsure, but because when you go up against someone with wealth, you don't bring assumptions. You bring evidence, timelines, coordinates, and enough procedural clarity to withstand pressure from any direction. I started with the earliest survey, 1997, when I purchased the property. The legal description of the lot clearly marked the eastern boundary, 18 feet from the edge of the stream's high water mark. This was critical not just for my ownership but for state environmental law. According to RCW 90.58, that stream, even seasonal, was under riparian protection as it connected into fish-bearing habitat within a quarter mile. The new fence was a problem not because it was unsightly, not because it pressed into my garden, but because it cut straight through the protected vegetation zone the state had marked as sensitive habitat. The irony is, James hadn't just broken property law. He'd stepped into the realm of environmental compliance, a space with consequences far larger than neighborly disputes. I drafted a letter, not to James. To the Shoreline Management Division at the Washington Department of Ecology. No dramatics, just an exact account of the fence's dimensions, its GPS coordinates, the original site maps, and the observed violations. I included photographs, time-stamped, satellite overlays, and excerpts from the Washington Administrative Code on Riparian Encroachment. Then I sent it, certified mail and digitally through the DEC portal. It was no longer a private issue, and I didn't need to say another word. Asterisk that weekend, James hosted some sort of garden gathering. Cars lined up along the gravel shoulder. String lights flickered from his new deck, and somewhere behind the soft laughter and cocktail clinks I heard the distinct hiss of a gas fire pit roaring to life, too close to the tree line. He had guests in the yard, walking up to the fence, admiring the straight lines and the artificial turf that had replaced the ferns and sedges. They really leveled it out. Huh, I heard someone say. Worth every penny, another voice answered. I stayed inside. I've learned that people don't see what they're destroying when it looks like progress. They only see flat lawns, stone walkways, and curated lighting. They don't see where the runoff goes. They don't notice the heron that hasn't returned since the bulldozers came through. They never feel the slow erosion under their own heels. On Wednesday, I received an email. Subject: Complaint Receipt File Number 27819B from Washington Department of Ecology Body. Thank you for your submission regarding potential buffer zone encroachment. A field investigator will be dispatched within 7 business days. Please retain any original survey documentation for review. 7 days. I went back outside and walked the fence line again. I didn't need to, but I wanted to stand there, among the flattened grass and broken bramble, and remember what used to grow here. Sword ferns, red osier, dogwood, skunk cabbage in the wetter patches. Gone now. In their place, poured cement, imported gravel, and the soft whistle of synthetic mesh twining through the slats. On the 6th day, a state vehicle rolled up, unmarked white truck, standard ecology plates. 2 officials stepped out, one carrying a field tablet, the other a roll of survey tape. I met them at the property line. Their names were Lisa Tran and Carlos Velez, compliance officers from the Environmental Protection Division. Mr. Winters, Lisa asked. Yes, we're here about the fencing complaint. Would you be able to walk us through what you observed? I nodded and showed them everything. The original markers, the faded survey pin still embedded near the foundation of my shed, the photos I'd taken the day construction started. They didn't speak much, just measured, scanned, logged GPS coordinates. Lisa took a water sample from the stream. Carlos used a soil probe on the flattened area near the new stone path. James stepped outside midway through. He didn't walk. Over just stood on his side of the fence, arms folded, eyebrows lifted slightly. Lisa gave him a wave and asked, "Are you the property owner here?" "I am," he said, "and I've got all the proper surveys on file, if that's what this is about." "It is," she replied professionally. "If you have documents available for review, we'll request them through formal channels." James shrugged. "Just let me know." He didn't look concerned, because men like him never are, not until it's far too late. By that evening, I'd received a follow-up message from the department. Preliminary site observation. Encroachment likely. Further review pending. It was short, dry, bureaucratic. But in those 6 words, I heard the first crack form beneath James's empire of poured concrete and glossy renderings. Made no announcements. I didn't gloat. I just watered the edge of my garden that evening, and let the silence settle again. But James didn't stay silent the next day. He sent a messenger. Her name was Colette, some kind of assistant or project manager. She showed up at my door holding a leather folder and a practiced smile. "Mr. Winters," she said, "James wanted to extend an apology if there was any misunderstanding about the property line. He's very open to resolving this privately." Privately? Well, through a conversation between parties. Mediation, maybe. There's no need to escalate things unnecessarily. I looked at her .com/professional, dressed like she'd stepped out of an office where deadlines are real, but consequences are always negotiable. "He built over a wetland buffer," I said plainly. "We understand that's your position," she answered smoothly. "But there may be alternative interpretations of the boundary." "No," I said, stepping back to close the door. "There aren't." The click of the door behind me felt louder than it should have, but it was the first door that would close for James. Many more would follow. 4 days after the compliance visit, a letter arrived, thick paper, government seal, formal header. It was a notice of violation, preliminary, not final, but the kind that makes people stop mid-conversation and read the fine print twice. It was addressed to James, but a courtesy copy had been sent to me as the reporting witness. The buffer zone had indeed been encroached. The fence cut 5 to 8 feet into the 50-foot protective boundary required by state law for riparian corridors connected to fish-bearing streams. That ditch, as James had once called it, had long ago been catalogued by the state as a migratory path for juvenile coho. And worse, the landscaped stone path leading up to the fence appeared to have displaced native soil and vegetation, a secondary violation under WAC 173-26. I set the letter down on the kitchen table and poured myself tea. Some people wage wars with rage, others win them with paper and silence. James didn't show up at my door again. Instead, a crew arrived mornings later with a backhoe and began pulling up the new gravel that had been spread along the lower path. They didn't touch the fence, not yet, but it was clear someone had told him to start reversing damage, or at least appear to. I stayed inside. I wasn't interested in theatrics. I knew what was coming. This wasn't about me anymore. The state had opened a full compliance case. There would be follow-up site visits, fines, deadlines, possibly even restoration orders. He could sense it too. That Friday evening, I spotted James sitting on a bench near the fence's edge, just where the land sloped down toward the stream. He was alone. No sunglasses, no guests, just a man looking at what he thought he owned, now quietly wondering where it had all gone wrong. I received a phone call the next Monday. "Mr. Winters, this is Officer Tran with the Department of Ecology. We've completed our initial findings, and will be issuing a full report to the property owner this week." I waited. The violations are clear, but there's an additional concern. "Go on," I said. "The building pad. There's evidence to suggest his foundation was poured less than 40 feet from the high water mark." I exhaled slowly. "And the requirement 50 minimum. The fence is one thing, but if the structure itself was improperly sited," she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "Any permanent structure built inside the setback without a variance, especially in a regulated corridor, could be ordered removed. Not always, but enough times to make it a legal and financial nightmare." "What happens next?" I asked. "There'll be a formal review. Then we issue either a compliance plan or a demolition recommendation, depending on the degree of violation. Timeline: 4 to 6 weeks. I thanked her, hung up, and sat back in my chair. That night, the wind picked up through the alder trees, shaking loose old cat cans and brittle leaves. I could hear the stream again, louder now, fuller from spring runoff. And I thought about the irony of James's situation. He'd built a monument to success right on the edge of something ancient. And now that ancient thing was rising to reclaim its space. By the end of that week, the rumors had started. Small-town gossip is like water through gravel, slow, persistent, and impossible to filter. I ran into David Marsh, the local hardware store manager, while picking up caulking compound. He raised an eyebrow and said, "So, I heard Arlo might have to move his whole deck." "I wouldn't know," I said, polite. "Guess the state's sniffing around." "They do that," I replied. 2 aisles over, I caught a whisper between 2 women in the gardening section. Something about permits and wetlands and some neighbor finally standing up to him. I didn't correct them. I didn't confirm or deny. I just paid and left. Because this was never meant to be a public performance. It was a correction. The next contact came by mail again. A formal request for survey verification. The state wanted my original survey maps and boundary records submitted for official comparison. I made copies, included a signed affidavit, sent it out, but I also included something else. 3 photographs I'd taken in early April. One showing the disturbed soil line where native sedge had been removed. Another showing the distance from the concrete pad to the stream during a typical high water week. And one final photo, a close-up of the juvenile coho, visible beneath the stream's surface, just feet from James's foundation. That wasn't just a matter of law. It was evidence of disruption in a living system that mattered, even to bureaucracies. Then came the appeal. James must have hired an attorney, maybe a whole firm, because the state received a 19-page rebuttal, claiming that the drone survey conducted for construction indicated no active stream corridor. The seasonal stream does not meet the criteria for riparian protections. The property suffered from unclear historical boundary records. The installation constitutes a good faith improvement based on interpreted boundaries. Read the response online through the public record portal. It was well written, technically impressive, and completely wrong. I drafted a public comment response and submitted it within 48 hours, complete with references to the state's 2021 wetland reclassification bulletin and the 2017 aerial floodplain overlay analysis for the region. I didn't need to argue, I just needed to point to the facts. And facts, when properly presented, have a weight no amount of spin can lift. James showed up once more, not at my door, but on the far side of the fence. He didn't speak, just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at the spot where the fence line had been marked in blue spray paint. The new temporary survey line set by the state. It was a full 6 feet back from where his crew had installed. The metal posts he bent down, touched the paint with 2 fingers, rubbed them together, then walked away. *3 weeks after the state's field report. The official letter arrived subject enforcement action, unauthorized encroachment into protected riparian buffer to Mr. James Arlo CC, Mr. Malcolm Winters, adjacent landowner. Reporting party from Washington State Department of Ecology Shoreline Management Division. The conclusion was clear. The fence violated riparian buffer regulations. The landscaped path disrupted hydric soil, and the poured foundation of the structure, the modern glass and cedar minimalist masterpiece James had dreamed into existence, had been placed 12 feet inside the protected 50-foot setback. That number mattered, because 12 feet was beyond what the department could forgive with a fine. The letter detailed the consequences: mandatory removal of the encroaching fence and stone path within 30 days, submission of a restoration plan for native vegetation replanting within 45 days, and worst of all, a recommendation for demolition of any structure within the restricted zone unless a retroactive variance could be proven. James had 10 business days to appeal, and in that time, his quiet confidence began to crack. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No more landscaping crews, no more guests on the deck, no more espresso-fueled walks to the edge of the creek. The house still stood, but it had lost its shine, like a showroom closed after hours, lights off, windows dark. Then came the surveyors. Different ones this time. Independent, not from the state. Hired by James, no doubt, to try and counter the state's report. But they weren't measuring the stream. They were measuring the house, its footprint, foundation alignment, elevation slope. It meant one thing: his attorneys were preparing for an appeal, but it was too late for that. The damage was in the ground. No number of arguments could replant, sedge, or shift a concrete pad 6 feet uphill. That same week, I received a knock on my door. It wasn't James, it was someone older, sharper, dressed like a corporate real estate mediator. Crisp slacks, leather folder, thin-framed glasses. He introduced himself as Mr. Carlton, representing the Arlo family in an effort to reach an amicable resolution. He spoke gently, used words like miscommunication, shared landscape, and civil compromise. "We're prepared to offer a financial settlement in exchange for withdrawing your statement to the department," he said, sliding a printed agreement across my dining table. I didn't look at it. I didn't submit a statement out of malice, I said. I submitted it because it was true. He smiled like someone used to convincing people otherwise. "Of course, Mr. Winters. But these things can be nuanced. The boundary encroachment isn't in dispute." "But the environmental classification was never ambiguous," I interrupted. "That stream's been flagged since 1991. I have the documentation." He straightened slightly. Less smile, more calculation. "Mr. Arlo is willing to offer $50,000, not as a bribe, of course, as a goodwill resolution. It's not about the money. It always is. Eventually." I pushed the paper back toward him. "Then you'll want to save yours." He left without another word. I didn't follow him. I didn't need to. By the time the appeal was filed, the story had caught the attention of the Olympia Weekly Ledger, a quiet regional newspaper with a fondness for bureaucratic missteps and local corruption. A friend of mine, Rachel Connors, wrote for their environmental desk. She'd seen the public record queue and called me to confirm. "Malcolm, is this the same guy who built the concrete deck over the spring-fed inlet?" "The same. He's appealing a demolition recommendation." "Yes." There was a pause, then a low whistle. "That's bold." Rachel's article ran the next Sunday. The headline was small: "But direct app developer's dream home faces demolition after violating riparian law." It included images from the inspection report, quotes from unnamed DEQ officials, and a full breakdown of Washington's environmental buffer regulations. No mention of me by name, just the adjacent landowner who filed the initial concern. But the article spread fast, reposted on regional forums, shared on neighborhood sites, and even picked up by a couple of local radio stations. Suddenly, James wasn't just a property owner. He was the guy trying to keep a mansion that violated habitat protections. And in towns like ours, where rivers still run clear and salmon still matter, that's not a title anyone wants. The final appeal hearing was held on Zoom, publicly available. I watched it with my tea and a printed copy of the 1991 hydrology report sitting beside me. James didn't speak. His lawyer did, a fast-talking man in a navy tie who argued that the streaming question only meets seasonal flow intermittently, and that misclassified hydric soils led to unintentional encroachment. Then the department replied, and their tone was surgical. They displayed overlays, satellite imagery, before and after photos, digital elevation models showing water runoff patterns. They quoted soil moisture content, amphibian counts, and even coho fry migration logs. By the end, there wasn't much left to say. The decision was delivered 3 days later. Appeal denied. The enforcement order would stand: demolition and restoration within 90 days. That Friday, I watched from my deck as a white truck arrived again, the same one from weeks ago. Lisa Tran stepped out with another officer. This time she wasn't carrying a tablet. She carried the final notice. I didn't see James come to the door, but I did see the envelope handed over, and the slow closing of the glass front door. It was done. He would have to remove the fence, the deck, and a portion of the structure itself, the living room and attached greenhouse, a monument to short-sightedness, scheduled for erasure that evening. I walked down to the stream. The light was soft through the alders. A blue heron moved along the bank, stepping through the shallows like it remembered this place, now that the noise had stopped, now that the stones were being lifted. I crouched and ran my fingers through the cold water. The current didn't care about wealth. The roots didn't care about property lines, and the land had always remembered where it ended, even when people forgot. Asterisk. The first boards came down on a misty Tuesday in May. No press release, no neighbors standing by, just a demolition crew in yellow vests unloading panel saws and pry bars from the back of a flatbed. Quiet, clinical, professional. They started with the greenhouse, that glass box James had been so proud of. The structure had been illegal from the moment it was built. It sat directly atop the riparian buffer, its concrete footing poured without regard for the fragile slope beneath. You could see it in the way water no longer pooled in the low spots. The sediment had shifted, the grasses had stopped growing. As the glass panes shattered into blue dust under the weight of steel boots, I stayed inside, not because I wanted to gloat but because it was done. The system had worked. The land would be given back, inch by inch, species by species, until the trees remembered how to shade the banks again. By Thursday, the deck was gone. The new fence, once so proudly level and gleaming, had already been removed days earlier. The metal posts, carefully drilled into earth that didn't belong to him, had been uprooted, and the stone path that had once hosted cocktail laughter and soft-heeled footsteps was now just a smear of disturbed soil awaiting replanting. Each day the crews came and went. Each day the outline of James's getaway estate became thinner, as if the land itself was erasing it like an old drawing being gently sanded away. Then came the notices. The county levied administrative fines, not massive, but steady. The state filed a restoration order requiring full compliance. Native grasses, riparian sedges, hand-seeded alder saplings. Even the soil had to be replenished, not just filled, but restored with matching pH and sediment density, verified by environmental labs. Every step, measured. Every shovel of earth, documented. Read about it in the compliance report, made public once the demolition was underway. What struck me wasn't the bureaucratic tone. I was used to that, but the weight of the penalties. By the time the final costs were tallied, James was out close to $2.4 million in restoration expenses, not including the lost value of the demolished structures. And that didn't include what came next. The bank froze his construction loan drawer without a functioning property or completed project. His credit line dried up. That app firm he'd founded, the one that licensed his proprietary back-end systems to grocery chains, quietly dissolved after a merger fell through. I heard through a former client of mine that James had tried to liquidate shares early, but the valuation had already tanked by July. A for sale sign went up at the edge of the access road, not a real estate agent's sign, a bank foreclosure sign. Property held pending restoration completion. No buyers, no showings, just silence, and the sound of frogs slowly returning to the stream. I saw James one final time. He was loading a box into the back of a dusty black SUV, the same one he used to park out front like a badge. His hair had grown out, and he looked tired in a way that expensive fabrics can't hide. No more visitors, no more assistants. Just him, packing up what was left. I didn't wave, he didn't look up, but I watched him pause for a long moment at the edge of the property. Just where the fence had stood, that invisible line he'd once decided didn't matter. I imagined what he saw, nothing dramatic. Just a slope of recovering brush, a thin line of new willow shoots tracing the bend of the stream. He got in the car, pulled away, never came back. The restoration work took nearly a year. The Department of Ecology oversaw every phase. Students from a nearby university's environmental program came out to assist measuring sediment runoff, tracking regrowth rates, and logging macroinvertebrate activity as the water quality improved. One of them asked if they could set up a time-lapse camera to document the recovery. I agreed, though. Why not let someone else watch what I already knew, that when people leave the land alone, it remembers how to heal. By the following spring, the property was unrecognizable, not because of what was added, but because of what was taken away. Gone were the foreign stones, the decking, the artificial boundaries that once sliced through the waterline like a scar. In their place grew native things: sedge, skunk, cabbage, rushes, things that bent in the wind and filtered the rain. Even the stream ran differently, as if it had been holding its breath. One evening, while walking the edge of the buffer zone, I spotted something I hadn't seen in 5 years. A mother deer, with 2 fawns, standing in the tall grass just where James's deck used to be. They stared, still and curious. I nodded gently and walked the other way. They didn't move. Months later, I received a letter, handwritten, no return address, but I recognized the PENMANSHIP. It was short. You were right about the stream. I wasn't. I didn't understand what it meant to live beside something older than money. I do now, Jay. I folded the note and placed it in the old cedar box where I keep things I never expected to need again. My first property deed, a photo of the creek from 1999, and the water quality reports from the year the coho came back. The note joined them, not as a trophy, but as a marker, because this wasn't about revenge. It never was. It was about remembering that some lines on a map aren't negotiable, and that when you choose to build on sacred ground, be it with steel, pride, or ignorance, the land always finds a way to remind you where you truly stand.